the very last thing we're going to do is to learn how to write better web server code that separates our computation on one hand from the HTML on the other. Right? If we look at our main handler now, the one that queries our database and makes an HTML page with the entire contents of our database, this is really a mess, right? It combines, completely interleaves our database queries and our HTML. And that is just a disaster in the making. Imagine we had a really sophisticated page that might be hundreds of lines of HTML, and we haven't even worried about or learned about JavaScript and CSS, but web pages can get pretty complicated. If that code is right in the middle of our Python server code that is doing our database queries and our computations, this just gets really complicated. What we would much rather do is have a separate standalone HTML file that just has the HTML, and then let our Python code having just do our standard database and computation stuff. The problem is, how do we connect them? If we just wrote an HTML file, well, how could that display the contents of our database if the database was being calculated on Python? And the answer is we're going to use something called templates. The idea of a template is it's an addition to the HTML file that isn't actually HTML. Instead, what happens is the server, while it loads the HTML, before it sends it across the web to the web browser, to the client, the server looks for special characters in the HTML file that says this should really get replaced on the server by some information that the server has determined. Put in some content from the Python code, generate solid HTML, strip out those special characters, and send that over to down to the client, and then the web browser finally receives that, which is just pure HTML, and displays HTML. So there still is a relationship between the HTML and the Python, but it's as separated as it can be, and this is the common way to do this. It's a little bit complicated, so I'm just going to draw a picture to show a little bit more clearly exactly what's going on here.
So what's happened in the past is when you ask for a web page in your browser, this is what happens. You type in a URL. That URL gets sent to a server, right? This is our Google App Engine Python code. Our code executes, and it so far has been dynamically generating HTML and returns HTML, which gets displayed in the window. This is purely dynamic, and this is what we have that's a bit of a mess. The next approach, which would be very fine, but doesn't combine the data with the HTML, would be if we had a separate HTML file that was just sitting here. Now what could happen is if you ask for your URL, it could still execute our code. But what our code could do is do whatever we want. Then it could basically tell Google App Engine to take this HTML file and return its contents to the browser and let that get displayed. That would work if you had static HTML. The interesting part is what happens if we want to be able to take some data from our Python code and insert it in here. So in order to do that, we're going to use these templates. So a template is just HTML where some bits of this code are some special characters, some special symbols that we'll talk about in a minute, that are not HTML. And now what happens is the request comes in, our code executes, it does its computation, and it will actually build a dictionary of values, key value pairs, with the data that we want to display in the HTML. This gets sent into a special template engine, which is some Python code that Google App Engine supplies. And it will execute this code that takes the dictionary. Actually, I guess a better way to show this is here's the template engine. The template engine takes the dictionary and the HTML, combines them by replacing these special characters with whatever data is requested from in the dictionary, generates real HTML, sends that back to the client, and then the web browser displays that HTML. The web browser can't tell the difference between these three models, because in all cases it's sending a URL to a server and getting back HTML. But in one case, our Python code generated HTML. In another case, it returned a static HTML file. And in the third case, it generated HTML by combining data with an HTML file using a template. This is really by far the most common way in complex websites that HTML is created, and that's what we're going to talk about now.
So now we're going to learn how to use these Google App Engine templates to take the HTML out of main handler and put it into a separate HTML file. So let's go ahead and make that HTML file. Make a new HTML file. I'll just call it index since it's really the home page. PyCharm sets up a bunch of stuff here for us. We'll just say runner database. And in the head, in the title, and the body, we can just put something started with something basic. We'll just say here's the list of runners. Maybe make it bold, runners, and put a line break. This, of course, is static HTML. What we really want to do is pull out some of the content that we're talking about before. So I'm going to go back to our Python program. To get started, we have to do a little bit of setup. The first thing we need to do is import the package. Actually, two packages. We have to import OS, the operating system, because we need that in order to access the files, because our program is now going to be reading in a file. And we use the templating library, and it is called Jinja2. There's actually a bunch of templating libraries. There's another very common one called Django, but they all are conceptually similar. In fact, even the syntax for them is very similar. At the beginning of our code, we have to set up an environment variable called jinja_environment, and I'm just going to type in this exact thing, which you should copy yourself. Then we can go back to the main handler that we want to build, and let's pull out the HTML because we don't need the HTML anymore. And instead what we need to do is load in that index.html file as a template. So we're going to make a variable called template, use that Jinja environment variable we made, and say get template, and give the name of the HTML file, which we made it just index.html. And now we're going to use the response object, which is a thing that we've used before to write out, but instead of, actually we are going to call it write, but instead of just giving it a string, we're going to take that template and tell it to render itself with template values. Template values is the dictionary I told you about. We haven't made that yet, so let's go ahead and make that. Template values is going to be a dictionary. We'll fill it in with some actual values. And this is the magic here that takes the dictionary and the HTML file and combines them and generates the actual HTML that gets written out. So let's start by, let's not worry about the database just yet. Let's just hard code in just to see how this works, something values. So let's just say we had a name, and this is a dictionary, so name, and maybe it's just going to be my name, Ben Peterson, and let's just make some stuff up. Say runners is, let's say there's 5 of them. Right, completely made up, but just so I have some data that I can go and put into my HTML file. So I've got name and runners. So how do I get those things? Well, this is all HTML. The special magic comes in the form of braces. If you put 2 left braces, then the thing inside here gets evaluated as one of those dictionary keys that we saw before. So remember, we had the dictionary key name. If I put name in here, this is not HTML, right? This is special template language. This says, look in the dictionary that is being provided for the key name and replace this whole line, both the braces and the thing, with its value. Okay, and let's just now we can combine. We can go back and forth between HTML and just put right in the middle of this template stuff. So let's say we're going to have number of runners. We want to get that number 5 out of there, and that was labeled. That was the key runners. So we'll do something similar. Finally, before we run this, we have to do one more bit of configuration. We need to open up the app.yaml file, and we need to tell the local SDK for Google App Engine that we're going to be using this Jinja 2 library. So under libraries, we add a new entry that is name Jinja 2, and we can just say use the latest version, like this. All right. Go back here, go to localhost and run this, and look at this. We have generated exactly what we were hoping here. And if we go, let's go look at the source code, because it's a little bit interesting. Right? This is the exact HTML we had, but notice there's no templates. The client receives the expanded templates, right? Compare that to the HTML file we had, right? We had the bold runners, and we've got the bold runners. But instead of name, the client gets Ben Peterson. Then the break, and then number of runners, colon, and then this part here gets replaced with the value that came from this dictionary of template values. So that's the core idea. Now, what we need to be able to do is give it the values we actually want, which is a list of activities for the current runner.